Good morning, everyone. So I want to welcome everyone to MEREDA's first live stream event. We have over 200 attendees registered for this event today, and that's really fantastic. MEREDA, as you know, sponsors our morning meeting breakfast conferences, and we've been missing seeing everyone at those events over the course of the last month or so. So we're pleased to be able to do this. We hope to be able to do, a few more of these before we get together again live. I'm Gary Vogel, president of MEREDA, also an attorney at Drummond Woodsum. MEREDA decided to conduct this event because we were hearing from many of our members that they were really in difficult situations and sort of an unknown relating to what's happening with the ability to service their mortgages, tenants being out of business, not paying rent, or having an inability to pay rent. And as most people know, the CARES Act and the Payroll Protection Loan Program really doesn't have anything in there to help landlords, especially commercial or residential landlords. And the relief is intended for tenants and businesses, and that's good. And to the extent that it goes to them and enables them to help pay their rent and pay their employees and so forth, that's really beneficial. But it leaves many landlords in a situation where there are many businesses that don't qualify for that relief, didn't get that relief. And so we're trying to address that for the benefit of our members. We have a panel of MEREDA members who are going to help us in this discussion today. Before I introduce them, I just also want to mention that the things we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the governor's executive order that restricts evictions. We're going to talk about some of the relief that's available. What should tenants and landlords be doing? As everybody knows, the governor's order prohibits evictions. I think the last thing that most of our members and landlords want to be doing is evicting tenants who are unable to pay during the coronavirus, as a result of the coronavirus. We're really all in this together. Tenants, businesses are suffering. The impact is certainly felt by landlords, their lenders, and so it's really imperative to make this work for everyone. Just enabling landlords to evict tenants is not a good solution. We need the tenants to survive. And so we're going to be talking about all of those things. But I'd like to now introduce our panelists and also to thank our morning menu breakfast sponsor, Norway Savings Bank, who sponsors all of our morning menu conferences that we put on. So thank you, Norway Savings. Anyway, for our panelists, we have Josh Benthian from Northland Enterprises. Josh is the CEO and a partner of Northland. They are a commercial landlord, and Josh is going to be able to fill us in on what he's seeing as it relates to being a landlord and what he's hearing from his tenants. We also have Mark Stasium. Mark is a senior vice president and a commercial real estate lender at Camden National Bank. And our meeting is going to be moderated by Andrea Maker at Pierce Atwood, who is our legislative counsel to MEREDA. And I'm going to turn it over to Andrea to take the helm of our virtual event here.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. I know that this is a topic that is near and dear to many people's hearts, and appreciate you all joining us. As we were preparing to present this webinar to you this morning, we talked through how the best way would be to organize it. And we thought that we would spend time talking first about tenants and what tenants can do to help themselves to pay their rents. Then talk about landlords and what they can do to help the tenants and themselves, and then the lenders and what they can do to help the net system, because it is an entire system that we're working with. Before we get started, I just want to say that we do have a chat box for you. If you'd like to ask questions in that chat box, you may. I will see those questions on a screen that I have on a computer in my lap, when then what you're seeing me on. And toward the end of the program, I'll bring my attention to questions and put some of them to the panel. So with that, when we think about tenants and how they are finding themselves in situations, we have commercial tenants, we have residential tenants. And let's talk first about commercial tenants. And maybe the way to start that conversation is to ask Josh, who's a landlord of commercial tenants, to describe to us the various types of tenants that he has in relation to their ability to have revenue or government programs or not help them with their rents.
Thanks, Andrea. So we have 330,000 square feet of commercial space that we own and manage, and 20% of that is retail, and of that, I would say 10 to 12% is local retail. We do have 136 apartment units that we own and manage as well. The commercial tenants, from the commercial standpoint, what we found is that the office, we have some data center, those tenants have been less affected currently. We've had discussions with them, and they seem to have been able to, continue to have some sporadic operations. They're not feeling it just yet. What has been across the board, we've been reached out to every one of our retail tenants has reached out to us and asked for some sort of rent forgiveness or restructuring. So that has been the bulk of my time the last month, has been trying to help them and to work through their troubles. You've got some that are just closed because they're a gym and they can't have operations at all. Then you have food and beverage that might have transitioned to online ordering and pickup. So we've been helping them, suggesting banks to talk to you about the PPP loan when that was open and taking applications, and hopefully will be shortly. Again, the EIDL loan from SBA is another one that several tenants have applied for. And there's a FAME economic disaster loan too that I know that a couple have received. So, from our perspective, we do have some relationships where we've been helping some of our tenants look at that. But those are some of the things that they can go after. The PPP loan has not been as helpful for everyone because of some of their structures where they don't have employees. Like we have a hair salon who doesn't have the ability to get the PPP loan. So we've been working with them to try to figure out other options in a time where they can't bring any revenue in.
Thank you, Josh. Gary, maybe you could talk a little bit about the PPP loans, which it's a generous contribution from the federal government to help businesses. But with respect to their ability to pay rent through those PPP loans, do you want to discuss that a bit?
Sure. So I think people have heard a lot about the PPP loans, and obviously it's a great program. It provides for a forgivable loan. To the extent that it's not forgivable, its interest is at 1% and it's repaid in 2 years. Most businesses are interested in the forgivable aspect of it, not wanting to take on a lot of debt when they're not sure what their revenue situation is. So in order for the loan to be 100% forgivable, you have to use 75% of the proceeds for payroll over the course of the 8 weeks following the receipt of the loan. And you can use 25% of it for other expenses such as rent and utilities and interest on debt. So depending upon sort of a business's, a tenant's kind of employee census, that's 75% and leaving 25% for rent and utilities and other expenses may be a good fit for some businesses that have a fairly substantial portion of their overall operating expenses payroll. Other businesses may find that that their payroll really only encompasses a small portion because they're a manufacturing business or because they the nature of their business is that they've got a lot of, cost of goods or things like that. So for many businesses, they may feel very, very reluctant to potentially use, 25% of the loan to pay their rent, where they're not sure whether or not they're going to be able to have the loan be forgivable. Obviously, we also know that the payroll protection loan ran out very quickly. It's just been reauthorized. I would certainly be encouraging our any landlords who have tenants who have not yet weren't able to get in on the first round to go apply for the payroll protection loan. I mean, even if you were able to get 50% of it, forgiven, it's still a very good deal to be able to have 2 years. And you can always, pay back portions of that you decide not to use. Let's say you want to make sure that it's 100% forgivable. Businesses may choose to pay back portions of it that they would otherwise have to repay.
So there's some limitations on how that can help landlords. And then we've also discussed in earlier conversations that landlords typically are very small enterprises themselves without a lot of employees, so they don't necessarily benefit from the PPP program themselves directly. Which
that's correct. I mean, very few landlords themselves will qualify to be a recipient of a payroll protection loan because they typically don't have employees. A typical landlord, will have a property manager, or even if they have a couple of employees. That's a really good example of a business that doesn't really line up. There's no way a landlord who might have 2 or 3 maintenance employees, can use 75% of the loan for payroll.
So while we're talking about tenants, let's talk about residential tenants for a few minutes. So the position that they are in is under the Federal CARES Act. Any properties that are secured with government-backed mortgages are prohibited from rental evictions for 120 days for their tenants. And then many states and cities across the country have also done their own versions of eviction protections for residential tenants. And in Maine, last Thursday, the 16th of April, Governor Mills did issue her order on eviction protections. And in that order, if a landlord is looking to try to evict a tenant for non-payment of rent during this COVID-19 period, they have to give if they're a tenant at will, instead of a 30-day notice for that tenancy termination, it needs to be a 60-day notice. And if the termination notice is for a non-payment of rent, it's a 7-day termination notice period for that under the law. She's extended that to 30 days. But at the same time, our courts are closed. And so, and the courts just extended their closings until the middle of May. This means that, courts aren't going to entertain any motions for evictions anyway during that time period, unless there's bad conduct by the tenant that rises to the level of extraordinary and urgent circumstances. This is, something is going on that's dangerous, that's illegal. A landlord can still go to a judge now and ask for an ability to evict a tenant based on that type of conduct. But basically, the governor is trying to secure homes and business locations for tenants during this COVID-19 period. And she's making it more difficult for landlords to move tenants out for non-payment of rent. And she's also written letters to the banks and the credit unions asking them to suspend any foreclosure proceedings that they're under, and also avoid issuing or initiating any additional foreclosures. Her interest, I was listening to the press conference when she announced this order, her interest is to please try to allow for everyone to stay in place during this COVID period. Don't move them out because of lack of payment. But she did do a couple of other things. for residential tenants, she's offered a fund. It's got $5 million in it to provide a one-time $500 payment toward rent. And if a landlord accepts that as a partial payment for rent, or then they agree not to try to evict a tenant during that month that one-time payment is made. She's made that one-time payment available so to act as a bridge for tenants until the federal funds come through for unemployment or the $1,200 stimulus check that will also, or should also, help tenants be able to pay their rent. There is still room in that program for additional applications. The Maine State Housing Authority is trying to understand how they can get the word out more. Now, if you are a tenant in a subsidized housing situation or a low-income tax credit housing project, then you're not able to qualify for this. And you have to meet certain income requirements and asset requirements to qualify for it. But it is there as a support for folks. And we're finding the Maine Association of Apartment Owners and Property Managers did some research and have identified that for April payment anyway, there was a relatively small portion of residential tenants who were not paying rent. And some portion, around 10% of tenants, were asking for some help in terms of partial payment or alternative arrangements. We don't know what May will bring. It's kind of the circumstance around residentials. Anyone on the panel want to add to that or have any additional observations around that?
Yeah, so I was looking at our portfolio, and granted, it's not gigantic, but of the 136 units in March, so I would say we have a mix of Section 8 affordable housing, LIHTC, and then mixed income, but conventionally financed projects. So the mixed income project, we have 1 out of 36 units that's delinquent. We had 4 in the month of April that were late, and we've worked with, through payment plans, installments throughout the month. 1 is still delinquent. The rest, which actually, the Section 8, which makes sense because I think those are the folks that are hit hardest by, an immediate reduction in income and employment. We've had a bit more late and just kind of unresolved delinquency. We're typically around 98, 99% economic occupancy. So of who's occupying a unit, how many of them are actually paying on time and not being late. In March, we were at 93% at the end of the month, and it looks like we're going to be about 87%. So still relatively good numbers, but we're seeing a decline. I think it'll be interesting to see next month, particularly in light of the stimulus money that I hope is making it to some of our tenants, and it's going to ease some of their burden. With the Section 8, they're paying 30% of their income, but I think it takes a little bit of time to adjust when your income drops to 0. So there's also a lag there for some of our properties. But I think we've been having a lot of discussions with the tenants to try to work things out. Regardless of an eviction ban, it's not something we want to do. And I think any tenant who's open and I think they're relieved that we're not wanting to do that. And other landlords I've talked to, the same thing. If they call a tenant and say, "Hey, let's work on a payment plan," it's generally the response is, "Oh, thank goodness, we were so worried you were going to try to kick us out." And I don't think anyone wants to do that right now. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see the next month and next couple months, but that's been our experience.
And I would echo Josh's comments, Andrea. We're going to talk about debt relief in a little bit, but most of the requests we're seeing at Camden with respect to debt relief are generally not coming from apartment owners. The apartment owners we've been talking to generally, are performing pretty well. I would say the folks I've spoken with have experienced maybe 5 to 10% of their tenants that they're working with that were having issues making their April rent payment. Of course, a lot of tenants who got laid off are, their unemployment is kicked in, which is supplemented by the federal unemployment supplement of $600 a week beyond what the state's going to pay. So for tenants who have been laid off, a lot of them really won't be seeing a huge difference in their income as a result of that benefit in the near term. So most of what we're seeing has been on the retail side as far as landlords who are seeking debt relief. Like I said, we have not seen a lot of issues in residential apartment portfolios. So.
Okay, thank you.
The one thing I'd like to add.
There's a question here. Gary, go ahead.
Yeah, the one thing I'd like to add is just sort of more from the kind of 10,000 foot, perspective. I think one of the things that MEREDA was worried about when we saw or heard that the governor was potentially going to issue her executive order was whether or not tenants would perceive the closure of the courts to evictions, as sort of a rent holiday. And, it's encouraging to hear from, Mark and Josh that their experiences that tenants aren't expecting, that rent is going to go away or be forgiven. After all, the landlords have expenses in terms of taxes, insurance, mortgage payments, and so forth. I do think that there is some level of tenants who may, and this may be applied to both residential and commercial, who are looking for the government to basically declare sort of rent holidays or rent forgiveness. Hopefully that won't be the case, but I think we're going to continue to be, hearing about that. I think our legislators on the state and federal level recognize that if you do that, you have to provide some relief to the landlord. So we were encouraged when the governor's order specifically said that this executive order does not affect the obligation of the tenants to pay rent. At the same time, I do think that this is kind of going to be, for many, businesses and for many landlords, sort of a slow-moving kind of tsunami where, for many businesses, it may take a long time, for their revenues to recover. And, it's easy enough for us to deal with this for a couple of months, but for many of our tenants and for many landlords, they may be dealing with the impact of this for a year or longer.
Thank you. Well, that's actually a good segue to talk a little bit more about what this circumstance causes for landlords and the position that they're put in. Josh, maybe you could explain how you worked closely with some of your tenants to address the situation, and then what you also then need to do with your lender.
Yeah, I agree with what Jerry just said. I mean, we kind of look at this as using a race car analogy that it's the first couple laps of a long race, and we don't know where this is going to go. And so we've kind of got to keep in the back of our mind, we've got investors, we've got tenants, we've got lenders that are partners that have been vital to our being able to do what we do. And we've got to take the long view on how we make sure everyone is fairly addressed and protected as much as we can. We have limited resources to spread around. So what we've done, one of our first conversations is with our lenders, because we want to, keep them posted and be transparent and say, here's what we're thinking. We're going to, have discussions with our tenants, looking at our cash position, our reserves, or, where we are with our debt. Here's what we're thinking we might want to do. Not surprise them later on. So, with that said, we then go, a tenant who has asked us for relief, and we'll say, let's for a retail complex, for instance, where 100% of the tenants have asked for relief. It's a challenge because we want to be fair. We want to do what we can to help. We want our tenants to survive, but taking what we have as a resource is, we can't just say, all right, no one pays rent for 3 months. It's just not an option that we have. So what we've asked is, for a tenant to say, what are you doing? How's your business transitioning? How do you see the next 3 to 6 months? What are you what are those other resources that you're exploring to help your business survive? Loans you've applied for, things like that. And then we'd like to see, some financials, because I think I was talking to a CFO of one of our tenants yesterday, and he's like, what is it? There's a playbook out there, and the first person that every tenant's supposed to call is their landlord and ask for 3 months free rent. And I'm like, yeah, it does kind of seem like that. So we've said and this is more pertaining to our national tenants who I think it truly is their playbook. It's the first call they make. We say, let's see last year's financials. Let's look at your year to date, and let's talk about, how your sales are going to be affected going forward. Some of them just say flat out, no, we're not going to share that. And no, thanks. We'll just pay the rent. How long that lasts will be interesting, but that has been one of our criteria of let's understand how this is affecting you. Our local tenants and they've been a lot more transparent and said, here's how it's affecting us. And then we're able to say, okay, this is what we'll be able to provide. And it's 3 to 6 months, depending on which property, some reduction. We still have expenses. We still have, we've worked to lower our CAMs, our operating expenses. But some go up. We have security patrols now. We've had people breaking into buildings and sleeping overnight. So where trash removal goes down, security patrols have gone up. And we need to keep the buildings and everything safe. So, we say we still have operating expenses. We need some contribution for that. We try to say, here's a reduction in rent, but then over the next year or two, there will be a payback of that deferment of rent. We do try to structure things. So if a tenant has a renewal option, if they exercise a renewal, we might say we can forgive it, or we can amortize longer than 2 years to try to be fair and give some incentive to being able to keep them long term. So we try to be creative and address tenants individually, but in the most fair way we can.
Great. Other comments on this?
So one of the things that we're doing to help our landlord clients is to provide them with essentially agreements to enter into with their tenants to provide for the repayment of that rent, over a period of time, typically a year. So if you end up with 3 months worth of deferred, partial or fully deferred rent, from a landlord's perspective, it's better to have an agreement with the tenant. It's really better for both the landlord and the tenant to have an agreement. The tenant doesn't want to have a situation where they're effectively in default and they've just got a verbal, acknowledgement from their landlord that, yeah, we're going to work with you, but not have any kind of arrangement that they know that they can live with. So landlords really should be entering into agreements with their tenants to repay the rent, typically, in installments, together with the rent that becomes due, maybe starting 30 days after their business is able to reopen. And that would be really beneficial, to everyone. In a way, from the tenants, in a way that they feel like they'll be able to afford those payments, and from the landlord so that they can plan for their cash flow. And also, we're going to be talking, Mark's going to be talking about, how this is impacting banks and everything that they're doing. When a landlord has those arrangements in place with their tenants, they're much in a better position to discuss what they can do with their lender.
Great. Well, thank you. And there again is another good segue over to Mark, who has done a little bit of research with some other banks and his own to talk about what lenders are doing to respond to this situation.
Thanks, Andrea. So I'm gonna MEREDA did a survey of other banks and how we've all been responding to this crisis. So I'm going to share a document with everybody, and hopefully this works. So here is just initially, hopefully you all see that on your screen.
Yeah.
So
it's up, Mark.
Okay, great. So debt relief requests began, obviously we started hearing from a lot of borrowers in mid to late March regarding, my tenants aren't paying rent. It started with hotels, but has also moved into other asset classes, particularly Retail landlords, as we've been talking about, we don't have rent coming in, and I need some payment relief. And this created a bit of a quandary for lenders because normally to entertain any kind of debt relief request and forbearance or deferral of loan payments is what is known as a troubled debt restructure, and that's a regulatory classification. It's not something that Camden or any of the local banks came up with on their own. It's a regulatory classification that gets reported on our financials and balance sheets. Basically, a troubled debt restructure is, you'll see defined on the screen, it's a modification of the terms of a loan as a TDR when a borrower is troubled, i.e. experiencing financial difficulties, and a financial institution grants a concession to the borrower that it would not otherwise consider. So clearly, when we have borrowers coming to us and requesting payment relief, that would normally, in normal times, trigger this classification. And what does that classification mean to us? Well, basically, it means we have to make a significant increase in loan loss reserves for any loan that's become a TDR. Another problem with TDRs is once that classification is made, it's very difficult to return that loan to a performing status, and essentially becomes an asset and a relationship that the bank needs to try to exit, generally speaking, so it can eliminate that TDR classification on its balance sheet and release the reserves tied to that loan. So that was a big concern that we all had when these requests started coming in. Fortunately, the regulatory agencies responded very quickly and said, if we're providing relief with respect to COVID-19, we would not have to classify these loans as TDRs, and that was formally approved as part of the CARES Act. The CARES Act, formally approved by Congress, indicated that treatment of TDRs is suspended related to accounting through the end of 2020 or 60 days after the national emergency terminates, whichever is sooner. So that has given banks flexibility to respond to these requests, which of course is very important for a lot of borrowers. So in light of that, as I mentioned, we took a quick survey of member banks, MEREDA member banks. We had 9 responses to ask everyone how are the banks in Maine dealing with customer requests. So question number 1, we went out and asked the banks, your bank's response with respect to debt relief requests to date has been, we've provided relief with no questions asked. 33% of the respondents, or 1/3, basically said, yeah, we just provided relief without any questions asked. 2/3 agreed to provide relief, but they wanted to have a better understanding of the situation. They in all likelihood are asking, what tenants have you been in touch with? Who's paying? Who's not paying? What are you negotiating new terms with them? The banks, generally wanted to have an understanding of what was going on and more specifically how they were being impacted. Question number 2, we asked, my bank has provided relief, has provided the following with respect to the length of debt payment relief provided. So basically, no payment relief, obviously. None of the banks said we wouldn't provide any relief at all. 2/3 of the banks indicated we've been providing relief, most commonly up to 3 months. 1/3 of the banks that responded said we are most commonly providing relief for 3 to 6 months, or greater than 3 months, but up to 6 months. And nobody was saying they were providing relief for longer than 6 months. So I think what this slide speaks to is that as lenders, we were certainly willing to help and wanted to help, but we didn't really want to nobody knew how long this emergency is going to impact anybody, particularly when these, requests were coming in late March, early April. Nobody really knows or understands, are things going to be back to normal in, June, July, the fall? I mean, nobody really knows. Nobody really still knows, although obviously there's some indications that some of the governors are starting to consider opening up their states for more business. And I think at the end of the day, banks said, we don't want to give you 6 months relief when things may be back to normal by July. So we'll give you 3 months relief. And then if things are continuing to be an issue beyond that, we're going to need to get together to have another conversation. Question number 3, we asked, my bank has generally provided debt payment relief as follows. Bank has deferred principal. One out of 9 said the bank has deferred principal payments but wants borrower to make interest-only payments. In other words, they weren't willing to forego interest. They want at least their interest payments. A third of the banks responded they're willing to defer both principal and interest payments, and if they did that, interest would continue to accrue and be paid at a later date or be added to the principal balance. Over 55% of the banks responded. Our response has been dependent on the extent of the impact of the borrower's cash flow. Basically, we were saying, if you've got some income coming in, but not 100% of what you normally would be getting in, but have enough money coming in to service, to at least make interest payments, would like you to do that. If you really are impacted to such a great extent that you really can't make interest payments, we would be willing to provide full principal and interest deferrals. So I think a lot of banks took that approach, that sort of evaluated the borrower's cash flow, figured out what you could afford to do, and if you could afford to make interest payments, that's the agreement that they came to. The last question, maybe the most important right now, is if the impact of COVID-19 extends beyond the initial debt relief term. In other words, if we gave you 3 months and then 3 months comes by and we're still having a lot of difficulty, what as a bank are you expecting to respond to requests for additional relief beyond that initial term? So most of the banks said we will provide relief subject to continued understanding of the borrower's income and cash flow. Again, they're going to want to know who's paying, who's not paying, and will base their decision on a further extension based on that. A smaller number of banks indicated that they would consider further relief, but could potentially be subject to additional negotiation and further credit enhancements. Things like, as the borrower, do you have capacity to inject cash to help yourself out? Is there any additional collateral you might obtain for the bank to help put the bank in a more secure position? Things like guarantees could be on the table if particularly if it's a non-recourse loan. So that all sort of, all those things may be on the table if someone's seeking further relief beyond the initial debt relief period. So just some final thoughts, from the lending perspective, obviously, things remain very unpredictable, which makes it difficult, a difficult lending environment. The most important thing, I think, if you're a borrower, is communication. Really, your banks are going to want to know, and I think Josh mentioned this earlier. Stay in close contact with your lender. I expect that a lot of lenders will be looking for current financial information. They'll want to know, what you've done with your tenants, who's performing, who's not performing, what you've negotiated with them, and what your cash flow looks like. So I think as always, communication between banks and their borrowers is going to be important. Finally, this is obviously having an impact on new loan opportunities too. We've heard of some banks that are just sort of exited the market. They're just not entertaining new requests right now. We've all been inundated with, debt relief requests and the SBA PPP requests. So there's been very little capacity for new requests, pretty much for the entire month of April. We're all wondering what's the impact going to be on new acquisitions, new developments. Finally, I think you can expect that lenders will be looking at more conservative loan structures than we were, say, 60 to 90 days ago. Obviously, it's been a very good lending environment, good borrowing environment for the last several years. You may see lending get a little bit more conservative in the terms that lenders are willing to offer. So with that, I will kick it back to you, Andrea.
Terrific. Yeah, we're there. Thank you very much.
We're there. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. That was really helpful, and I just wanted to give a shout out to Shelley Clark at MEREDA for helping process that survey that Mark just shared with you. Gary, any reactions that you want to share with reactions to what Mark just shared with us?
Sure. As I was listening to Mark, I'm thinking, this would be a good topic for another webinar that we might do, with sort of structuring deals in a post-COVID-19 environment, because I do think that, one of the benefits that we're in this economy, or at least the economy that we were in before the pandemic started, was that the economy was strong, property values were strong, most borrowers were not highly leveraged, compared to, say, where we were in the Great Recession, where lending was over 100%. There were various different structures that some lenders had used to allow their borrowers to be really highly leveraged. That's not the situation here. So there's typically more leeway and benefits, or more, that borrowers have more flexibility and some equity to be able to absorb some of these, this impact. But going forward, for example, I think in valuations, I think that appraisers are going to be looking to potentially have higher vacancy rates. Lenders are going to be looking for higher amounts of reserves for lost rent or other things, and it's certainly going to affect the valuations and structures as it relates to to these going forward.
Thank you. Josh, anything that you want to add to this, or your experience with your lender?
Well, I think we're lucky as a landlord who's operating in Maine, talking to colleagues and friends who have New York and Boston properties. I'd say I feel very lucky that we have the banks that we do here. And as Mark showed, I think they're being very flexible and helpful in this process. I think it's interesting because I don't think there's any one party, whether it's a tenant, a landlord, or the lender, who really has a ton of leverage right now. I don't think lenders want to take all these properties back. We don't want to lose all of our tenants. Tenants don't want to leave and not have a place to operate when business opens up again. So it really is, we need to be open and work together, and not keep our cards too close to the vest. And I think that's been our philosophy, talking to the banks and trying to be as prudent and conservative as we can, but not withhold help to those who we can help. So I couldn't do it without our banks helping us. So yeah.
It sure does feel like there's a sense of community that's emerging through this process, that we are all in this together, and the only way we're going to get out of it and be strong is to work together to get there. Yeah. Wherever there will be. So let me go to a couple of the questions. We've received 3 questions here online. I'm told my audio is very choppy. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. Yep. Anyway, I've received 3 questions online, and we got one in advance through email. It's a similar question, and it has to do with force majeure. So the question is, does the force majeure clause give tenants a legal foundation for relief from paying rent? And does this also provide mortgage holders the same relief? Gary, you want to start to address that?
Sure. So I can't tell you how many times I've written the term force majeure in the course of the last few weeks. Not only with respect to leases, but construction contracts and everything else. In fact, it used to be every time I dealt with it, I had to look up the spelling of majeure, but now I have it memorized. So that says something. But in any event, you really need to look at the force majeure clause on a case-by-case basis. I think the person who sent in that question sent us one that was written very broadly. And just so that everybody understands what a force majeure clause is, it's typically a provision in a contract that says that if some event occurs that's outside of the control of the party to the contract, that they may be entitled to relief. What that relief is, the contract may spell out. And it's typically for acts of God, acts of war, and things like that. And whether in many instances, people probably didn't really think about a global pandemic as a event that you needed to contract for in a force majeure clause. So some of them are written very broadly, and they very well may cover this. And if you have a lease that has a broad force majeure clause, the tenant very well may have an opportunity to have a rent forgiveness during that period of time. I do think that one of the things that we're all going to be looking at going forward in lease renewals and new leases and all kinds of contracts is drafting force majeure, clauses to try to address this. And then what it really ends up being is sort of an allocation of risk between the landlord and the tenant. Who's going to take the responsibility, if the space is not usable because of the fact that you have a governmental stay-at-home order or something like that. So they have to be looked at on a case-by-case basis when we're dealing with existing leases. If you don't have a force majeure clause in a lease, then you're not entitled to any kind of relief just because it's something out of your control.
Okay, but you said basically it's a case-by-case basis to analyze what the language is in the contract and what the circumstances are.
Exactly, because the language can differ widely, and they tend to be negotiated, or at least now they are. In the past, a lot of times people didn't pay a lot of attention. You put it in that said acts of God, acts of war, and other things, delays and strikes and things like that, and we didn't typically pay a lot of attention to them, and people are going to be paying a lot of attention to those clauses going forward.
Yeah, with respect to pandemics. Josh, anything you want to add to that, or you think Gary covered it?
No, I'd agree. I mean, I've gone through all of ours, and there were some where we were able to specifically have language that's very clear that says subject to tenant's obligation to paying rent withstanding the other obligations might be waived. There are others where it's less clear, and then some that are what was shared this morning that are very broad. Yeah, so I think it's a thing that is will definitely everyone's going to pay a lot more attention to, and how quickly tenants are exercising the force majeure clause is also something. When you have a tenant who's operating, albeit at a lower volume, and they try to do it, that's kind of part of the discussion. Is that a complete force majeure, or so? It's a case by case, and it's a learning experience for us because. As Gary said, you didn't really plan on a war or global strike. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. So a couple of other questions, unless Mark, did you want to add anything to that one?
Nope. Why don't you move?
Okay.
Next question would be good.
Okay, next question. This comes from someone who's self-employed or is speaking on behalf of someone who's self-employed, asking if there's any assistance available for self-employed tenants who don't have employees, so they don't qualify for the Paycheck Protection Program. Gary, you want to take that one?
Or Mark? So it's like Mark.
I could jump in.
Ready?
Yeah,
Oh, Mark,
I don't know that that's. Yeah, that's really not accurate. If someone's an independent contractor and typically filing a Schedule C, then they can apply for a PPP loan in the monthly. I think everyone who's seen a PPP application knows that the loan amount is driven by monthly payroll. In the case of a sole proprietor, that monthly payroll is basically 1/12 of your annual net income reported. I believe it's on line 31 of your Schedule C. I guess the folks that I guess there are some cases where if they have an LLC formed or something and they aren't paying themselves a salary, they're making draws or distributions or something to that effect. They might not be eligible. That may be accurate, but generally speaking, if you're filing a Schedule C, you are eligible and can submit an application to your bank. We've seen a lot of those.
I think
there was a delay. There was a delay. I'd add, that first week, the government said if you're a sole proprietor, independent contractor, you weren't eligible to apply for that first week. But beginning, I believe it was that second Friday, we started to see a lot of applications from sole proprietorships, and so.
And that, although the first round of Paycheck Protection Program was used up, Congress has just passed another round of it, and I don't know if the president has signed it yet, but he's expected to sign it, and there'll be another whole round of funding available for paycheck protection programs. Next question is there any recommendation for relief for small commercial landlords with non-paying tenants and who do not use conventional financing?
Through the PPP program or otherwise?
Well, the question, anyone have experience?
I'll jump in a little bit just to frame this, and I certainly know a couple of situations. So, for example, let's say you have some elderly landlords that have owned their building for a long time. They may not have a mortgage because they've owned the building for 40 years and they've paid it off, but they have operating expenses. They have in some instances people might have home equity loans that they've taken out to put in a new boiler in their commercial building because their home is debt free and their building doesn't have a mortgage on it. Obviously they don't have the same level of expenses, but they can't go talk to their bank, their commercial lender, because they don't have one, to forgive the rent payments, the mortgage payments. So, persons in a situation like that, if they may be able to go get a home equity loan, they may be able to get relief from payments on a home equity loan if they have it, but they're really, and they may qualify for, some of the other, the SBA economic, relief program. I will say, that someone in that situation, if you don't have a mortgage on your property, you're typically going to have a lot of borrowing capacity, and maybe you only need a mortgage for a small percentage of the value of your property. You may be able to, when the banks have some availability in terms of manpower, you probably are very bankable. Even if a large percentage of your tenants aren't paying rent, but it's not like you've got the ability to just pick up the phone and say, can you suspend my mortgage payments for a few months?
Thank you, Gary. I just wanted to, Mark, were you going to speak?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
If I could just jump in, because I think one of the things about the question that we've encountered is that there have been some tenants who haven't paid rent, but have agreed to pay something after we've had discussions with them. So, I would just encourage a small landlord like that to, try to, resist the urge to be confrontational, which as a landlord, if a tenant's not paying rent, is hard to resist sometimes, but to reach out to them and try to structure something. And, with the understanding that there may be a ban on evictions for several months here, but you still owe the rent. And when in 3 or 4 months, if the tenant has been uncooperative, they may be getting evicted. And it's again trying to work together. In terms of the financing thing, I agree with Gary and don't have much to add there. But I think trying to get some payment is important.
Okay, thank you,
So,
Josh.
Andrea, there is one thing I want to add about the sort of eviction issue, and that is that, unfortunately, for some businesses are not going to survive this, whether they be a small restaurant that just doesn't have the fortitude or the capital to be able to survive this, despite federal resources that may be available. So I do think that landlords are going to have a certain amount of businesses that go out and spaces that become available. One of the things, if you hear from a tenant and the tenant says to you, they're just going to close up shop. And one of the things a landlord really needs to do, especially with the courts closed for evictions, is to try to secure an agreement with that tenant to surrender the space, especially if they have a written lease. And the importance of that is because if you have a lease with a tenant and you have not been able to terminate it and to get legally to get possession of the property, the process to do that is eviction. And if unfortunately the governor's order didn't carve out an exception for this. So I think it's important for landlords to enter into sort of lease surrender or termination agreements with tenants who say they're not coming back. And those can be challenging because typically a landlord doesn't want to, basically say you're released from all of your obligations, and yet that's exactly what a tenant wants to do. And so sometimes you can't reach an agreement because from a landlord's perspective, you say, look, we're going to terminate the tenancy, but you're still obligated, subject to our obligation to try to mitigate our losses by trying to re-rent the space. And so I would encourage everyone to try to get those surrender agreements in place if you're in that situation, especially if you're not going to be able to avail yourselves of the eviction process, just to get sort of clear title to your space that you can re-rent.
Thank you, Gary. And there's another question related to the eviction circumstance in Maine in the order. The question is, do folks have a sense or any experience with what would qualify as urgent and compelling reasons, which would qualify a forcible entry and detainer matter for hearing before May 15th? And in the governor's order, she does list a number of behaviors that could give rise to an eviction even during this time period. And that would include when a tenant is acting in such a way that it's harmful to people or harmful to property, or there's illegal activity being conducted on the property. There's a list of about 7, I think, activities that could give rise to an eviction even during this time. And I would say that at the end of this program on the MEREDA website, not only will we'll be posting a recording of this webinar, there's also going to be a document written by Gary that was submitted to Maine Biz that covers a lot of this material, and the alerts that MEREDA has sent out recently. And in those alerts, one of those alerts is a link directly to the governor's order, and you can go in and see those specific behaviors that she spelled out in the order that could still allow for an eviction to proceed. She's looking for protection for people who can't pay rent, not for protection for people who are bad actors. There's another question here, sort of the force majeure, I think. Does anyone have experience with insurance coverage where COVID is covered? My screen keeps jumping because they keep coming in. Where COVID is covered as business interruption. Want me to repeat that? That's kind of, does anyone have experience with insurance coverage where COVID is covered as business interruption? Attorney Gary, is that for you?
So that, this is the subject that we could have a whole nother seminar on regarding business interruption claims. And I wish we had an insurance person on our panel right now, because, business interruption coverage is, I think the insurance industry has done a better job than maybe the legal industry of sort of foreseeing this type of event, and many business interruption policies specifically exclude this kind of coverage. I do know that there are a number of lawsuits that are going on sort of nationwide, and there's a big push within the insurance industry. I would encourage people to look at their business interruption policies very carefully, talk to their insurance agent and see whether or not their business interruption insurance may cover them, or importantly, whether a tenant's business interruption insurance may cover their tenant, so that the tenant gets some recovery in order to be able to pay the rent. But I do think that's a challenging area, because oftentimes the policies are written in such a way that they may not cover this. This is an issue that's been in the news a lot. So if you want to do a search of, there's been a lot of articles in the New York Times and other national publications on this issue.
Thank you. I just noticed it's 10 o'clock. And this webinar is over at 10 o'clock. So there are a couple of questions left here. Maybe we can try to answer them offline so that we can terminate this webinar on time. Gary, I'm going to turn it back to you to close.
Okay, thank you. So again, I think our first attempt at doing a live streaming webinar for MEREDA's breakfast morning menu breakfast program has been a success. We hope to do this again. Thank everyone who registered. We had over 200 people registered for the event, which is really remarkable. As Andrea said, we are going to post this on our website. It'll be available to anyone who wants to go there, and depending upon how long the restrictions exist, we hope to be presenting more events like this. I do think that as we're enabled to go back to work, it's very likely that there may be restrictions on large events. So while we may be able to work, we may not be able to go to a MEREDA breakfast seminar, and we'll be looking to have other timely topics that we can present and get information out to our members. But again, thanks everyone for tuning in. Thank you to Norway Savings Bank for sponsoring our breakfast events, and I hope everyone has a good day and stays safe.